Because what we have to do if we're to tackle, if we move ahead in climate action, we have to have major investment in energy transition. We have to have major investment in adaptation. We have to do both. There's not some sort of contest, one or the other. We have to do both because the climate change is already with us. It's going to get worse. And of course, we have to invest very strongly in our natural capital. And India is rich in biodiversity. It's a big part of the world system, but the whole biome of the world is the natural infrastructure on which we depend for our air and our water and so on. So what could those investments give us? Well, first, the clean is cheaper than the dirty across at least a third of emissions, particularly electricity and surface transport. And we can see now, and you already see in India what has happened to the price of renewable energy. And that's reflected in the investment. Last year, 90% or more of investment in electricity capacity was in renewables. The market is following the statement that the clean is cheaper than the dirty. That will happen and is happening in electric vehicles. More than half in China of the vehicles sold last year were electric, more than 90% in Norway and so on. That's moving very quickly. So the first is the clean is cheap. Not everywhere. That's not true of air travel. It's not true of sea travel. It's not true of steel and cement. So those are areas where we have to make progress. Well, first, clean is cheaper than the dirty. Second, there's economies of scale. Look what happened to LED light bulbs in India when you went to scale. Crashed by a factor of 4, right, in just 2-3 years. Same is happening with the electric vehicles and particularly the buses. So you see, you've got those economies of scale coming. You've got systems, and this is probably the most important point, along with efficiency. But the systems, Indian cities are a catastrophe. We all know that. I've been coming to India for 50 years and watched them get worse and worse. 94 of the most polluted cities in the world, 94 of the 100 most polluted cities in the world are here in India. And that's probably India lose maybe 1.5 million people a year from air pollution, and that doesn't count the people you maim. Million, yeah. So 1.5 million people a year would be losing their lives from air pollution in India, out of a total of maybe 5 to 10 million in the world. And of course, if you maim people, that doesn't count the maiming. Productivity goes down. Now, I hope we object to killing and maiming people. But it's also true, you can object to killing and maiming people because the productivity goes down. I mean, the first argument is more powerful, but it has a big effect on productivity. Land systems are degrading land, they're polluting rivers, they're destroying forests. These are systems which we can do so much better. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. So you've got all these arguments, along with, of course, the extra investment you need, say this is a story of driving growth. And it's going to be helped because we've got artificial intelligence with us at the same time. That was one piece of luck, a lot of bad luck in all this, but artificial intelligence is really going to help us in running our cities, our energy system, our transport systems, and so on. So this is not only is delay profoundly dangerous, for all the reasons I've described around the science, but this is a huge opportunity for development. And high carbon growth eventually is a contradiction in terms. It just kills itself on the destructive environment it creates.
But how do you respond to this, the argument that seems to be gaining some traction now, is that, the world is not going to come to an end at 2 degrees. There is life beyond 2 degrees. It is not impossible to imagine a better world, a more equal world beyond 2 degrees. And quite some serious players are making this kind of arguments, academics, also policymakers. Last year we had Bill Gates sort of make some similar arguments on this, that, hold on, this is not the end of the world, it's not an existential issue.
Well, I just described, probably at excessive length, all the difficult things that will happen. And if you're killing people on a massive scale through more than 50 degrees occurring quite often, and that may be only 15 years away in North India, Of course, for those people, it is existential. Is it existential for the world as a whole? No. I mean, if you went to 4 degrees and the population of the world was 3 billion and not 9 billion, then you'd have a world with people on it. Yeah. So in that sense, it's not existential. But for the 7 billion or 5 billion or whatever it was that lost their lives, that would be existential. So this is something which is actually close to science denial or science dismissal. We often call it lukewarmism. I mean, it is just flying in the face of the science. And Bill Gates has done so much for people in terms of the Gates Foundation. It's been a wonderful activity. But Bill just got this wrong, and he's not an economist, and he's not a climate scientist, and he simply didn't really register strongly enough what those risks were. Because if you're talking about girls' education, as we must, if you're talking about education, as we must, if you say that I'm going to do that first and do the climate later, you've simply got it the wrong way round. Because the climate then, with that postponement I've described, which is about the next 15, 20 years, then will undermine everything else. So it's not that you rank this outcome above that outcome. It's that you understand the mechanisms at work. And that's the failure in what you described before. And that's what Bill Gates got wrong in this one.
So one of the other central arguments in your book, and this is a point that you have made earlier also in your first Stern report of 2006 made the case that it was more efficient to make the climate investments now rather than do it later. And you have developed that idea further in this book, and then you say you actually talk about companies not investing adequately in climate action as one of the greatest market failures of our times. And you say there is an economic sense to this climate action, the fact that there is a lot of money to be made if companies and private investors actually look at it in a more careful manner. Now, one of the first lessons in economics is also the fact that investment money will find its way wherever there is an opportunity to make money. You actually don't have to do much. If there is an opportunity, if it senses an opportunity, it will find its way. Now, what is it that investors across the world are not being able to see in climate action, that we are not seeing enough flow of funds in the right places?
This is an absolutely key point, because you can't run down the old until you've invested in the new. So everything always comes back to sharply increasing investment in the new. The big majority of that investment will be and should be private sector investment, responding to the incentives it sees. Now, whether you read John Maynard Keynes or wherever, or Friedrich von Hayek, wherever you look, investment is about expectations. It's about expectations of revenue streams. It's about expectations of being able to get things done. If you try to build roads and railways in the UK, it will take you 10, 15 times as long as it takes you in China. Some things are just really difficult to get done because governments don't act in a way that make it simple enough to get it done. Try taking a transmission line from Spain through southern France. Well, Spain is full of almost zero-cost land with lots of sunshine. Yep. And we ought to be transporting solar electricity north. And that could transform the electricity possibilities in Europe. But there are real problems in getting them through. So that's problems about getting things done. On the other side, there's problems about revenue streams. So as you all know, that the Indian electricity system is the responsibility of the states. Now, I was born 1 year before independence. So in that 1 year, I take full responsibility. And the 1935 Government of India Act gave the responsibility for electricity to the states. Now, of course, if you want to run your election in the states and you want to woo the farmers, then you can give them very low-cost electricity. Well, if I'm an electricity generator, I'm looking for a revenue stream that will have real, that I can have confidence in. And so, whether it's on getting things done or it's the revenue streams, a big part of public responsibility is creating the conditions for that private sector investment to happen. If I want to build and sell electric vehicles, then there has to be a really good charging system. Well, the state will have a role in enabling that. Much of that charging system could be run by the private sector, but you have to make it easier to happen. So if you're going to reform agriculture across the world, then you are going to have different kinds of structures, which mean that less land is degraded, less rivers are polluted. That will all be public policy, and if the public policy is right, then that private investment can come through very strongly. And that's a very important part of the story now. If you see what we need to do as we can, then the challenge is to create the conditions so that it can happen. I've already said that quite a lot of it is happening, but not fast enough.
So is that the reason why you also make the case for a more active state? Is that the kind of idea that you mean from an active state, a state which gets involved more actively in climate action and creates the conditions and creates the spaces for private actors to do more than they are currently doing?
The answer is yes, and I've already described on the investment side the kind of actions that the state will need to take. If you look on the innovation and technology side, I recommend very strongly the work of Chris Freeman, who's the great historian of technology, looking at the way in which the state can facilitate innovation. It can invest in R&D and through its universities and its institutes. It can give better intellectual property rights so that people have a greater incentive to create more ideas. So there's the investment side, there's the R&D side, there's also dislocation. And what we're describing here will need a strong rundown in the mining of coal. Now, whole communities depend on the mining of coal for their incomes. So the challenge then, and this is a third part of the role of the state, is to invest in the people and places who are affected directly by that. Now, there's a very good example, or very bad example, of how not to do it. And that's in the United Kingdom in the 1980s. It was a devastating story of destructive social transformation. If you look at the way in Spain they've been doing it, it's been much better. So that's a third area, managing the inevitable dislocation, which is about investing in people and places. And a fourth area is finance. And a lot of this needs long-term finance where risk is shared. And development banking. And I was 10 years as chief economist, first of the European Bank and then of the World Bank. And development banking is a big part of the story. And I think that could be done much better in India. It's about the ability for people to share risk. Government can give more guarantees. You know, we talked earlier about power purchase agreements. They can give greater confidence in the purchase of the power from a private sector generating company. So those are, 4 or 5 areas in which there's so much for the state to do, and in getting the right kind of incentives in place so that that tremendous power of creativity and entrepreneurship in the private sector, innovation and investment, can actually take place. That's very different from the market fundamentalism that did so much damage in the 1990s.
But you make a very your book actually makes a very compelling economic case for climate action. But the international climate architecture is based on a fundamental assumption that faced with a crisis like this, all the actors, every country will come back together, cooperate with each other, and then sort of launch a joint fight against climate change. That's how this entire climate action works. Otherwise, it doesn't. So even if we assume that not all the 194 odd countries have to come together, but those 50, 60, 70 influential, consequential countries, they have to come together to take climate action. Now, the thing is, there is no example in history wherein countries have come together for one common cause. Very recent example that all of us remember is that of COVID-19. That was a much more immediate sort of existential crisis. 35 million or so deaths within 2 years. Now, we didn't actually see the world getting together, all the countries getting. Of course, there was some vaccine program going on, through Gavi, uh, but it was actually struggling for funds. It didn't do very well. So countries were actually doing what uh, they wanted to do for their citizens, not as a global citizen. So this concept of global citizen and global governance hasn't really worked. So in that kind of thing, is it then impractical to assume that everyone will come together and solve the climate crisis, whereas the natural thing to do is what is happening now, that everyone is fending for themselves, do whatever they can to protect their citizens. Is it unnatural to expect that everyone will come together?
The, um, the first part of the answer is that it's very important that we understand the growth story, that climate action is actually a much better way of growing the economy in terms of productivity, in terms of efficiency, in terms of the systems, in terms of not poisoning each other. So that the more people understand the growth story, the less the problem you just described, because it's in their self-interest to do it, and it's in their interest that other people do it, and that means that there is a payoff to mutual support. So you can make yourself better off, but by collaborating with others, you can also make yourself better off. And this is an unusual story. And we have to do something that hasn't been done before. But if we say we can't do it because it hasn't been done before, then nothing happens. And that's the most unrealistic thing of all. Delay is deeply dangerous. Driving towards a cliff and saying, I don't know how to turn the wheel, is not realistic. You'd better learn how to turn the wheel pretty quickly, right? And if you say, oh, well, I can't do it, and we'll just drive off the cliff, what kind of realism is that? I also wouldn't be quite as pessimistic as the way you put it, and probably you're not either, but the world got rid of smallpox. That really did take collaboration. We've almost got rid of polio. We could get rid of malaria if we really put our mind and action to it. So some things can happen. Paris happened, yeah? And when we went into Paris, we thought we were headed for 4 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. It may be 2.5 plus or 3 by the end of the century, just on current actions. On current commitments, it could be less than 2.5. So if you look at the forecast of emissions ahead of Paris for, say, 2030, they look to be about 30% higher than probably they will be. So it's not true that action is impossible, but it is true that we're moving much more slowly. And there's one final argument, and we've all noticed the rise of the far right. And one of the big arguments that they give is that they've got to stop migration. Yeah? Well, from what I've already said, if we don't tackle climate change, you're going to see hundreds of millions of people on the move. In the immortal words of Ronnie Reagan, you ain't seen nothing yet. Yeah? And so the right should understand that if they want to tackle migration, they'd better tackle climate change. And very interestingly, Giorgia Meloni, who is on the far right in Italy, is amongst the far right leaders by far the most thoughtful about climate change. Why? Because Italy is in the front line of migration.
Yeah. So, should the objective of climate action also be to turn the world into a more equitable world, not just a world which is less warmer, not just the world which is kept below 2 degrees Celsius, but also a world which is more equitable in terms of income distribution, in terms of energy access, in terms of resources. Because that's another argument that's often given, that the way it is structured right now, it seeks to perpetuate the kind of inequities that are there in the system as of now. And maybe we achieved by 2050, we do achieve the 2 degrees goal, but then it doesn't make the developing countries any better. The inequities that are there in the system are either perpetuated or actually become worse in some cases. So should that be the case as well? Or would including equity that ways, does that dilute climate action?
I think we must bring equity into the argument, and it absolutely reinforces the arguments for climate action. Climate change is deeply inequitable. The people most responsible for the concentrations in the atmosphere are the people who got rich on dirty development. And the consequences of climate change hit poor people earliest and hardest. They're the people who live in floodplains, in more vulnerable parts. They're the people who find it much more difficult to take defense against climate impacts and so on. So the status quo, letting it continue, is deeply inequitable. And there are some very positive possibilities from the point of equity. Around 70% or more of the renewable opportunities are in the developing world. I mean, when I was a student at school, I confess in the 50s, we were told that Manchester and Newcastle were where they were because steel needed iron ore and coal, and that's where the iron ore and coal were. Iron ore and coal were jolly heavy, and so they couldn't easily be moved around, so the people went to where they were, right? Well, now, the big endowment is sunshine and wind, particularly sunshine. And that is mostly in the developing world. And so what we're going to see is a new economic geography where if we collaborate well and if we invest well, that the economic geography will be about where energy is cheap and clean. And where that coincides where the new minerals are, then those are big advantages. There will be big advantages from the point of view of AI and so on as well, and the power that's needed. So these investments that we're talking about will have a twist towards the developing world. And that's a very good thing. So we had two pieces of luck in all this. One is AI came along at the right time to run and change systems. The second is that it's not all about solar, but particularly about solar. And that's where a lot of the developing world has an advantage. So this thing, so if you put that together with the inequity story of not doing things, that I described earlier, then the equity arguments point very powerfully to climate action. There's one final thing on that, which is we haven't used the language of justice here, and it's an important part of the story. Justice is a cheap and easy word that's thrown around too easily. I'm a student and close friend of Amartya Sen, and I recommend very strongly his book, The Idea of Justice. And his idea is that you can identify injustice. Injustice is a right denied, an entitlement denied, and then of course you need to discuss rights and entitlements. The right at issue we're talking about here is the right to development. You know, if you like it the way it's expressed in the American Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, that's predicated on thinkers much earlier than that, like Mary Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine and so on. But that right to development is a key part of our notion of a common humanity. And we haven't discussed much the ethics of all this. There's the argument of self-interest. The argument is the damage you do if you don't do it, if you're reckless and negligent. But there's also the ethics in all this. And that's an extremely important part of the story. And that points to the protection of the right to development, particularly of future generations, but also of poor people in these generations. And so if by emitting and if by letting that go forward, you damage that right to development, that key element of common humanity, then it's deeply unjust. So those who say just let it happen and so on, they're wrong on the science, they're wrong on the economics, and I also think they're flawed, deeply flawed on the ethics.
So I'll quickly squeeze in one question before I open it up for audience. What about the politics question? The governments do not feel compelled to enhance climate action because people are not voting on climate. And, the election of Trump is a very good example. Half the country actually voted for someone who was so proudly anti-climate. And till you have people voting on this issue, you won't see governments under pressure to enhance what they are already doing. So how do you get it more political?
With difficulty is the answer. I mean, that really is a very important challenge. But again, we can't back off any of these challenges, because if we do, that is the most unrealistic and damaging thing of all. I think it's very important that climate becomes more political, that people insist. I think it's very important that this idea that the clean is cheaper than the dirty and we can drive down the costs, which we can, people have to see that. In the United Kingdom, for example, we've loaded much too much of the investment cost up front on the electricity pricing. It's a serious economics mistake, and it's a serious political mistake. People have to see the advantages that we're talking about. I think people do see the advantages of cleaner air in cities. That's one element that I think people can get quite quickly. Some of this stuff has to be quick. And I think the lower price for electricity and the cleaner air in the cities are things that can come through quite quickly. Other parts of the story, of course, come through over a much longer period of time. So I think public policy should make it easier for people to recognize the fruits of all this. But also, we're very dependent on the young people. And, I have the good fortune to spend my life at a university. And you get older, but they stay the same age. And this, the last 10, 15 years, the cohort of students coming through have been pretty good on this issue. Sometimes they do too much identity politics and not enough environment and climate, but we can live with that. They must choose their own issues. But that, I think, is a very important part. And now we've got, through the geography teachers and the physics teachers in our schools across the world, we've got young people coming through who understand this. They understand that the CO2 molecule oscillates at a frequency which interferes with the infrared and it traps the heat there. You can learn that at school, right? And so those people coming through are our university students who'll give us more pressure. But that's taking too long. So we have to make it much more political. We have to show the benefits, and we have to educate the Trumps of the world.
Yeah. So let's open it up for the audience now. Please wait for the mics to come to you, and please be very brief. We'll take 3 questions at a time, and then he can address that. Yeah. So where is the mic? Yeah, we can begin. Someone in, right here in the second row. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, sir. Good afternoon. I'm Shamita, and I'm a student of Environment and Sustainable Development. And I found this talk very insightful. So my question to you is, you emphasized in your talk about the investment of finance in achieving climate goals. So, in particularly developing economies like India. So, in your understanding, do you think the COP process has been effective in mobilizing climate finance at this scale that is required? And if you think it's not, then what do you think needs to be changed?
Yeah. So there's a gentleman here. The gentleman in black in the 4th row.
I'm in white, but
Yeah, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. It feels like over the last few years we're moving away from multilateralism, as in both in trade and in climate policy. How about what do you think? What are your thoughts about moving more to a coalition of the willing, where countries like China, the European Union, many other developing countries actually move to having carbon taxes and essentially tariff barriers against energy imports and energy-intensive goods.
Yeah. And yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is around the source of energy. So you spoke a lot about wind and solar. What's the place for nuclear energy in the future?
Yeah, all very important questions. So let's do finance and COPs first. I haven't got time to give a full answer, but can I give you a reference and then briefly say something? There's this thing called the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance, which I co-chair with Veera Songway and Amar Bhattacharya. We published 4 reports and describing how that extra finance can happen. In that story, the multilateral development banks play a very big role because most of the investment and most of its finance will be private sector. But they worry correctly about all sorts of risks. So those multilateral development banks can take long-term positions, they can give guarantees, they can help bring down the risk and bring down the cost of capital. So it's going to be a combination of local, national governments, multilateral development banks, private sector, some philanthropy, some aid, which sadly is falling away. So you can have a group, as it were, of different sources of finance coming together, need different combinations for different purposes. Now that discussion is not particularly negotiated in the COPs, because the COPs are largely finance ministers and foreign ministers and so on, all lovely people, I suppose, but they're not finance ministers. And what we've been trying to do is to bring the finance ministers into that story through the kind of processes that we're describing. So that it wouldn't be actually official COP processes, but the COP can and should encourage it, and that's what we were doing in Belém just a couple of months ago. I do think the coalitions of the willing really matter. I know that language was somewhat tarnished around Iraq, but the coalitions of the willing really are very important here. And it's getting things done. And you don't actually need unanimity to make things happen. And, the electrodes, to use popular language now, the electrostates are going to win over the petrostates because it's just cheaper and cleaner and more sensible. The challenge is to make that happen quickly enough. The infrastructure of India that will exist in mid-century, more than half of that will be built between now and then. That's a measure of how fast we have to move. Because if that infrastructure looked anything like the old, then say goodbye to 2.5 degrees, possibly 3. I don't just mean India, of course, I mean the whole developing world. So to act quickly, we can't wait for unanimity, and we have to really get coalitions together. I don't think multilateralism is dead. I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to get the kind of unanimity we got in Paris. But to get the investment done, we don't really have to have as much of that. So I do think, well, that was the long answer. The short answer was yes. The nuclear side, I think the problem is so big that we have to use everything we've got. And nuclear is part of that story. But one thing we know about nuclear is that the first adjective you use is not speedy. And we are in a hurry, yeah? So I do think that nuclear is important. I do think it's part of the story. But I don't think it's going to be a dominant force in power generation in the next 20 years. In the 20 years after that, it could really be the case, and we may well have cheap fusion 20 years from now. It may be that small modular reactors going to scale can really come down in cost. And we have to go for both those things. We really do. But they're not going to save us in the next 20.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for any further questions. We'll have to end here and vacate the place for the next session. Thank you, Nick Stern. Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan, for this conversation and taking the time out. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for attending this session. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We'd like to thank Lord Nicholas Stern and Amitabh Sinha for an enchanting session, and also to Balakrishna Pisupati ji for introducing the session and moderating it through. The author will be signing his books outside at the Crossword Bookstore kiosk right outside the venue. I'd like to please remind everyone to maintain safety and security. Please keep the aisles free. This is for your own safety. We have a whole carpet area in front. I would request everyone to move in front, whoever can, and sit on the floor. We've got an interesting session coming up at 2 o'clock, and I'll see you all there. Thank you.